Sarah Martinez never imagined that her morning routine of checking medical supplies would become the prelude to the longest day of her life. In the remote mountains of Afghanistan, where silence could be more terrifying than gunfire, she was about to face a test that would push every limit of human endurance and courage. What started as a routine patrol mission would soon turn into a nightmare scenario where 200 soldiers lay bleeding in the dirt, their lives hanging by threads thinner than spider silk. In those crucial moments when chaos reigned supreme and death lurked behind every boulder, one woman would emerge as the difference between catastrophe and survival. This is not just another war story. This is the true account of how a 28-year-old field medic from Texas became a legend among warriors, carrying a wounded colonel on her back for 2 miles through enemy territory while coordinating the largest battlefield medical evacuation in recent military history. It's a story about the kind of heroism that doesn't seek glory, the kind of courage that blooms in the darkest hours, and the unbreakable spirit that refuses to let others die on her watch. When the first explosion shattered the morning calm, Sarah had no idea she was about to redefine what it means to be a hero. This is her story. The sun had barely kissed the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains when Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez began her daily ritual. At 28, she had already seen more blood and bandages than most people see in a lifetime, but she approached each new day with the same methodical precision that had kept dozens of soldiers alive. Her small hands moved with practiced efficiency as she counted morphine vials, checked the expiration dates on antibiotics, and ensured every piece of medical equipment was in perfect working order. Sarah stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her presence commanded respect from soldiers twice her size. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that never seemed to have a strand out of place, even after the longest days. The daughter of a mechanic and a nurse from San Antonio, Texas, she had learned early that attention to detail could mean the difference between fixing something and breaking it forever. In her world, that something was often a human life. The forward operating base where Sarah worked was tucked into a valley so remote that supply helicopters could only reach them twice a week, weather permitting. The landscape around them looked like something from another planet, all sharp rocks and impossibly blue sky. The silence could be so complete that soldiers sometimes forgot they were in one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan. It was the kind of silence that made men nervous, but Sarah had learned to find peace in it. Her medical station was a testament to organized efficiency. Every bandage had its place, every instrument was cleaned and ready. She had transformed what was essentially a reinforced tent into a miniature trauma center that could handle everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. The other soldiers often joked that Sarah could perform surgery with nothing but duct tape and determination, but they said it with the kind of reverence reserved for someone who had literally pulled them back from death's door. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for what intelligence reports suggested would be a routine patrol mission. The unit was scheduled to sweep a series of villages about 15 miles from their base, checking for insurgent activity and delivering medical supplies to local clinics. It was the kind of mission they had completed dozens of times before without incident. The biggest medical challenge Sarah usually faced on these patrols was treating soldiers for dehydration or the occasional sprained ankle from navigating the rocky terrain. Colonel James Mitchell, a veteran of 3 deployments and the kind of leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his men, stopped by Sarah's station during his morning rounds. At 45, he had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much war, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected officers in the region. He moved with the measured gait of someone whose left leg had been injured in an IED explosion 2 years earlier, but he never complained and never let it slow him down. "Ready for another scenic tour of the countryside, Doc?" he asked, using the nickname the soldiers had given Sarah despite the fact that she wasn't actually a doctor. She had earned the title through her skill and dedication, and it meant more to her than any formal recognition ever could. "Always ready, sir," Sarah replied, slinging her medical pack over her shoulder. The pack weighed 47 pounds when fully loaded, containing everything from basic bandages to surgical instruments to emergency blood plasma. She had customized it over months of trial and error, finding the perfect balance between being prepared for anything and being able to move quickly when lives were on the line. The patrol consisted of 200 soldiers from various units, an unusually large group for what was supposed to be a routine mission. Intelligence had suggested increased insurgent activity in the region, so command had decided to send a stronger force as both a deterrent and a show of strength. The convoy included 12 armored vehicles, 2 medical trucks, and enough firepower to handle most situations they might encounter. As the convoy prepared to depart, Sarah made one final check of her equipment. She tested her radio, ensured her GPS was working properly, and verified that she had direct communication links to both the convoy commander and the medical evacuation helicopter station of the main base. It was the same routine she followed before every mission, but something felt different this time. Not wrong exactly, but different in a way she couldn't quite identify. The first few hours of the patrol proceeded exactly as planned. The convoy moved through the mountainous terrain at a steady pace, stopping periodically to check bridges and investigate areas where insurgents might have placed improvised explosive devices. The soldiers were relaxed but alert, joking among themselves while maintaining their professional awareness of their surroundings. Sarah spent most of the journey reviewing medical protocols in her head and checking on the handful of soldiers who were dealing with minor health issues. Around midday, they reached the first village on their list. The local population was friendly, and several children ran alongside the vehicles as they entered the settlement. Sarah distributed basic medical supplies to the village doctor, an elderly man who had been caring for his community with limited resources for more than 30 years. They discussed the medical needs of the villagers, and Sarah made notes about supplies that could be included in future deliveries. The second village was quieter, but that wasn't unusual. The residents went about their daily business, offering polite nods to the soldiers, but keeping their distance. Sarah noticed that fewer children were visible, but she attributed this to the fact that it was the middle of the day when many would be helping their families with work or attending informal schools. The village elder accepted their medical supplies with gratitude and assured them that there had been no insurgent activity in the area. It was at the third village that things began to feel different. The settlement was almost completely deserted, with only a few elderly residents visible in the distance. The convoy commander made the decision to investigate more thoroughly, and Sarah prepared her medical supplies in case they encountered injured civilians. The silence was different here, heavier and more oppressive than the natural quiet of the mountains. Colonel Mitchell ordered half the convoy to establish a perimeter while the other half conducted a building-by-building search of the village. Sarah accompanied the search teams, ready to provide medical assistance if they found wounded civilians or evidence of violence. The buildings were empty, but showed no signs of struggle or hasty evacuation. Personal belongings were still in place. Cooking fires had been properly extinguished, and there were no signs of the chaos that would indicate people had fled in fear. As they completed their search of the village, Sarah noticed that Colonel Mitchell seemed increasingly concerned. He was studying satellite imagery on a ruggedized tablet and speaking in hushed tones with his communications officer. The intelligence reports they had received before the mission had indicated minimal threat levels for this area, but the abandoned village suggested that local residents knew something the military didn't. The decision was made to complete the patrol mission, but to return to base using a different route than originally planned. This was standard protocol when conditions on the ground didn't match intelligence expectations. Sarah packed her medical supplies back into the vehicles and prepared for what she hoped would be an uneventful journey home. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, she would be fighting to save more lives than she had ever imagined possible. As the convoy began its return journey, Sarah settled into the passenger seat of one of the medical vehicles and reviewed the day's activities in her mind. She had distributed medical supplies to 3 villages, treated 2 soldiers for minor cuts, and helped conduct searches that had turned up no evidence of insurgent activity. By any reasonable measure, It had been a successful mission. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and orange that reminded her of the sunsets she used to watch from her childhood home in Texas. The radio chatter was routine as the convoy navigated the winding mountain roads. Drivers reported their positions, scouts provided updates on road conditions ahead, and the convoy commander coordinated with air support to ensure their return route remained clear. Sarah found herself thinking about the letter she planned to write to her parents that evening, updating them on her work and assuring them that she was staying safe. The first hint that something was wrong came from the lead vehicle, whose driver reported what appeared to be debris blocking the road about a mile ahead. This wasn't unusual in the mountainous terrain, where rock slides and weather could create obstacles without warning. The convoy commander ordered a temporary halt while a team investigated the blockage to determine whether it was a natural occurrence or something more sinister. Sarah used the brief stop to check on her equipment one more time, ensuring that everything was secure for the remainder of the journey. She tested her radio connections and verified that her medical supplies were properly organized for quick access. It was during this routine check that she noticed Colonel Mitchell climbing out of his vehicle to personally assess the situation ahead. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture as he studied the blocked road through binoculars. The convoy remained stationary for nearly 20 minutes as the advance team investigated the debris. During this time, Sarah noticed that the radio chatter had become more focused and urgent. The teams were reporting that the roadblock appeared to be man-made, with logs and rocks arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. This discovery transformed what had been a routine return journey into a potential combat situation. The decision was made to clear the roadblock and continue along the planned route, but with increased security measures. Additional scouts were deployed to check the surrounding terrain for signs of ambush, and the convoy's weapon systems were brought to full readiness. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly as she recognized the shift from peacekeeping mission to potential combat operation. She had experienced this transition many times before, but it never became routine. As the convoy slowly approached the cleared roadblock, Sarah found herself thinking about the training exercises she had completed just months earlier. The scenarios had covered everything from treating casualties under fire to coordinating medical evacuations in hostile territory. She had excelled in these exercises, but she knew that real combat situations were always more chaotic and unpredictable than any simulation could replicate. The convoy had just passed through the area where the roadblock had been when the world exploded around them. The first improvised explosive device detonated directly under the lead vehicle, lifting the armored truck off the ground and flipping it onto its side. Before anyone could react, a coordinated barrage of rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow mountain road. In the space of 30 seconds, what had been a routine military convoy became a battlefield disaster. Vehicles were destroyed, soldiers were wounded, and Sarah Martinez was about to begin the most challenging medical mission of her career. The abandoned village had indeed been a warning, but not one that anyone could have properly interpreted. The insurgents had been planning this ambush for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike with devastating effect. As smoke filled the air and radio calls for help echoed through the mountains, Sarah grabbed her medical pack and prepared to step into chaos. She had no way of knowing that before the day was over, she would become a legend among the soldiers she served alongside, proving that heroism comes in all sizes and that courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by the decision to act despite it. The explosion that flipped the lead vehicle created a sound that Sarah Martinez would remember for the rest of her life. It wasn't just the thunderous blast of the improvised explosive device, but the metallic screaming of armored steel being torn apart, followed immediately by the most terrifying sound a medic could hear: the cries of wounded soldiers calling for help. In that instant, every routine patrol mission became a fight for survival, and Sarah's training kicked in with an intensity that surprised even her. The insurgent ambush had been planned with military precision. Hidden positions on both sides of the narrow mountain road erupted simultaneously with rocket-propelled grenades, automatic weapons fire, and additional explosive devices that had been buried along the convoy's route. The attackers had chosen their location perfectly, using the natural terrain to create a killing field where the convoy had limited options for maneuver or escape. Sarah's vehicle had been traveling the middle of the convoy when the attack began, which meant she was surrounded by chaos in every direction. The armored medical truck lurched violently as the driver attempted to find cover, but on the narrow mountain road, there was nowhere to go. Vehicles ahead were burning. Vehicles behind were taking heavy fire, and the steep rocky slopes on either side offered no escape route for the heavy military trucks. Through the reinforced windows of her vehicle, Sarah could see soldiers scrambling for cover behind damaged trucks, while others lay motionless in the dirt road. The professional part of her mind was already calculating casualties and prioritizing medical interventions, but first, she had to survive long enough to help anyone. Enemy fire was concentrated and accurate, suggesting that the ambush had been set up by experienced fighters who understood military tactics and vehicle vulnerabilities. The radio communications that had been routine and organized just minutes earlier had devolved into a cacophony of urgent calls for help. Vehicle commanders were reporting casualties, requesting immediate medical assistance, and attempting to coordinate defensive positions while under continuous fire. Sarah listened to the radio traffic while preparing her medical equipment, trying to get a clear picture of the overall situation so she could plan her response effectively. Her vehicle's driver, a young soldier named Peterson who had been with the unit for only 3 months, was struggling to maintain control as enemy fire impacted their armored protection. Sarah could see his hands shaking on the steering wheel, and she recognized the look of someone experiencing combat for the first time. She moved forward to the driver's position, speaking in the calm, authoritative voice she had learned to use in crisis situations. "Peterson, I need you to get us as close as possible to those wounded soldiers near the overturned lead vehicle," she told him, pointing toward the area where she could see at least 6 soldiers who were clearly in need of immediate medical attention. "Use the engine block for cover and stop where I can reach them quickly. Can you do that for me?" Peterson nodded, his jaw set with determination that reminded Sarah of herself during her first combat experience. He maneuvered the medical vehicle through the obstacle course of destroyed and damaged trucks, using their bulk as protection from the worst of the enemy fire. Sarah was already planning her approach to the wounded soldiers, mentally inventorying her medical supplies and calculating how many casualties she could realistically treat under the current conditions. The overturned lead vehicle had been carrying Colonel Mitchell and his command team, along with several soldiers from the Advanced Reconnaissance Unit. Sarah could see figures moving around the wreckage, but she couldn't tell from her position who was wounded and how seriously. The vehicle had come to rest on its side against a large boulder, creating a partial shelter from enemy fire, but it was also blocking access to anyone who might be trapped inside. When Peterson brought their vehicle to a stop behind the cover of another damaged truck, Sarah grabbed her medical pack and prepared to sprint across approximately 30 yards of open ground to reach the casualties. This was always the most dangerous moment for a field medic, the transition from relative safety to complete exposure while carrying equipment that made quick movement difficult. She had made similar runs dozens of times during her career, but never with this many casualties requiring attention. Sarah burst from the protection of the medical vehicle and immediately heard the distinctive crack of rifle bullets passing close to her position. The insurgents had clearly identified her as a medic and were specifically targeting her, understanding that eliminating medical personnel would maximize the psychological impact of their attack. She ran in a zigzag pattern, using every piece of cover available while making her way toward the overturned lead vehicle. The first soldier she reached was Sergeant Williams, a career infantry veteran who was conscious but bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to his left leg and arm. He was trying to provide covering fire for other wounded soldiers while applying pressure to his own wounds, displaying the kind of selfless courage that Sarah had learned to expect from the men and women she served alongside. She immediately began treating his injuries while gathering information about other casualties in the area. "How many wounded?" she asked Williams while applying a pressure bandage to the worst of his shrapnel wounds. "At least 15 that I can see from here," Williams replied, wincing as Sarah tightened the bandage. "The colonel is trapped in the lead vehicle with a couple of others. Vehicle's stable, but they can't get out without help, and at least 2 of them are hurt pretty bad." Sarah's mind was already racing through the tactical medical decisions she would need to make. 15 wounded soldiers was more than she had ever handled simultaneously, and if some of them required immediate surgical intervention, she would need to establish priorities that could mean the difference between life and death for multiple people. The fact that Colonel Mitchell was trapped complicated everything, as he was both a critical leader for coordinating their defense and potentially one of her most seriously wounded patients. She finished treating Williams' immediate bleeding and moved to the next casualty, a young soldier named Rodriguez who was unconscious with what appeared to be a serious head injury. Sarah quickly assessed his vital signs, checked his pupils for signs of brain trauma, and established an intravenous line to begin fluid replacement. Rodriguez needed immediate evacuation to a surgical facility, but with the convoy under heavy fire and helicopters unable to land, evacuation wasn't currently an option. The sound of approaching enemy fire forced Sarah to take cover behind the overturned vehicle, where she finally got a clear view of the situation inside. Colonel Mitchell was conscious, but trapped beneath part of the vehicle's roof structure that had collapsed during the rollover. His left leg was clearly broken, and Sarah could see blood on his uniform that suggested additional injuries. 2 other soldiers were in the vehicle with him, one unconscious and the other trying to help free the colonel despite his own obvious injuries. "Colonel, this is Martinez," Sarah called out while continuing to treat Rodriguez. "I need a quick assessment of your condition and the status of the other 2 soldiers with you." "Martinez, good to see you," Colonel Mitchell replied, his voice strained but clear. "I've got a broken leg and probably some internal bleeding, but I'm stable for now. Corporal Jackson here has a dislocated shoulder and some cuts, but Thompson is unconscious and bleeding from somewhere I can't see. We need to get him out of here fast." Sarah made the rapid calculations that every combat medic learns to make under pressure. She had multiple patients requiring immediate attention, limited medical supplies, ongoing enemy fire that made treatment extremely dangerous, and no immediate prospect of evacuation. The situation required her to function as both trauma surgeon and battlefield commander, making life and death decisions while under fire. She established Rodriguez in a stable position with his intravenous fluids running and protective positioning to prevent further head trauma, then focused her attention on extracting the soldiers from the overturned vehicle. This would require help from other soldiers, which meant coordinating a rescue operation while continuing to provide medical care to multiple casualties. Sarah used her radio to contact the convoy's remaining leadership and request assistance with casualty extraction. The response was immediate but not encouraging. The convoy was still under heavy attack, with enemy fire coming from multiple directions, and most of the available soldiers were engaged in defensive operations. She would have to organize her own extraction team from the walking wounded and soldiers who were in cover positions near her location. The next hour became a blur of medical procedures performed under the worst possible conditions. Sarah treated shrapnel wounds, stabilized fractures, managed blood loss, and established intravenous lines while constantly moving between patients and occasionally taking cover from enemy fire. She used every piece of medical knowledge she had acquired during years of training and experience adapting procedures for battlefield conditions and making decisions that would normally require consultation with senior medical officers. The extraction of Colonel Mitchell and the other trapped soldiers required careful coordination to avoid causing additional injuries. Sarah directed a team of 4 soldiers in using vehicle jacks and steel bars to lift the collapsed roof structure while she provided immediate medical stabilization for each soldier as he was freed. The process was made more complex by the need to maintain cover from enemy fire and the limited space available for maneuvering around the damaged vehicle. When Colonel Mitchell was finally extracted, Sarah's assessment revealed injuries that were more serious than his initial self-diagnosis had indicated. In addition to the obvious broken leg, he had internal bleeding that suggested damage to his spleen or other abdominal organs, and his blood pressure was dropping in a way that indicated he was going into shock. Without immediate surgical intervention, his condition would become life-threatening within hours. The soldier identified as Thompson had suffered severe head trauma and was showing signs of increasing intracranial pressure that required immediate intervention to prevent permanent brain damage or death. Sarah performed an emergency procedure to relieve the pressure, working with instruments designed for battlefield use while other soldiers provided cover fire. The procedure was successful, but Thompson would need immediate evacuation to a neurosurgical facility to have any chance of full recovery. As Sarah worked through the growing list of casualties, she became aware that the intensity of enemy fire was increasing rather than decreasing. Intelligence reports coming over the radio suggested that additional insurgent forces were moving toward their position, potentially turning the ambush into a siege situation where the convoy would be surrounded and unable to escape. The prospect of being trapped with multiple seriously wounded soldiers and limited medical supplies added urgency to every decision Sarah made. The convoy's remaining leadership was working to establish a defensive perimeter and call for reinforcements, but the remote location meant that help was hours away. Helicopter evacuation remained impossible due to enemy fire, and ground-based reinforcements would take time to navigate the mountainous terrain. Sarah realized that she would need to keep multiple critically wounded soldiers alive for much longer than she had originally anticipated. She began implementing battlefield medical protocols designed for extended operations under siege conditions. This meant establishing more permanent treatment positions, rationing medical supplies to ensure they would last for several hours, and training less seriously wounded soldiers to assist with basic medical procedures. Sarah had studied these protocols extensively, but had never implemented them in a real combat situation. The psychological pressure of the situation was enormous. Sarah was responsible not only for providing medical care, but also for making decisions about resource allocation that could determine which soldiers lived and which died. Military medical training prepared medics for these decisions intellectually, but the reality of looking into the eyes of wounded soldiers while deciding treatment priorities was something that no training could fully prepare someone for. As the afternoon wore on, enemy fire continued, but became more sporadic, suggesting that the insurgents were either running low on ammunition or repositioning for a different type of attack. Sarah used these brief lulls in the fighting to move between her patients, updating their treatment, and monitoring their vital signs. She had established a makeshift medical station behind the overturned lead vehicle, using its bulk as protection while treating the most seriously wounded soldiers. The radio brought mixed news throughout the afternoon. Reinforcements were en route, but were still several hours away. Air support was available, but couldn't provide close support due to the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions. Medical evacuation helicopters were standing by at the main base, but couldn't risk landing until the immediate threat was neutralized. Sarah was on her own with her wounded soldiers, fighting to keep them alive until help could arrive. By late afternoon, Sarah had treated more than 30 wounded soldiers, with injuries ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. She had performed emergency surgical procedures under fire, coordinated casualty evacuation within the convoy's defensive perimeter, and trained other soldiers to assist with medical care. Most importantly, she had kept every critically wounded soldier alive, including Colonel Mitchell, whose condition remained serious but stable. The insurgent attack had been devastating in its initial impact, but Sarah's medical response had prevented it from becoming the catastrophe it was designed to be. Her actions during the first few hours of the ambush had established the foundation for what would become a legendary display of medical skill and personal courage. But the day was far from over, and the most challenging part of her ordeal was yet to come. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sarah Martinez found herself facing a situation that no amount of medical training had prepared her for. The convoy's defensive perimeter was holding, but intelligence reports indicated that additional insurgent forces were moving through the mountains toward their position. The choice was becoming clear: wait for reinforcements that might arrive too late, or attempt to move the wounded soldiers to a more defensible position where helicopter evacuation might be possible. Colonel Mitchell's condition had stabilized temporarily, but Sarah knew that his internal bleeding required surgical intervention that she couldn't provide in the field. Thompson, the soldier with the severe head injury, was conscious but showing signs that his condition could deteriorate rapidly without proper medical facilities. She had 14 other soldiers with serious injuries that required ongoing medical attention, and her supplies were running dangerously low after hours of intensive treatment. The convoy commander, Major Harrison, who had assumed leadership after Colonel Mitchell was wounded, called Sarah to a brief tactical meeting behind one of the armored vehicles. Harrison was a competent officer, but he was struggling with the complexity of coordinating a defense while managing multiple wounded soldiers and limited resources. He looked to Sarah not just as a medic, but as someone whose judgment he had learned to trust during their months of working together. "Martinez, I need your honest assessment," Harrison said, studying a map of the surrounding terrain on his tablet. "Can we move the wounded, and if so, how far?" "Intelligence says there's a clearing about 2 miles from here, where helicopters might be able to land if we can get there before dark." Sarah studied the map while mentally reviewing the condition of each of her patients. Moving seriously wounded soldiers across 2 miles of mountain terrain would be incredibly dangerous, but staying in their current position with limited medical supplies and increasing enemy pressure could be even more dangerous. The decision required balancing immediate medical needs against tactical realities that could affect the survival of the entire unit. "Sir, we can move them, but it's going to be difficult," Sarah replied. "I have 4 soldiers who are critical and will need constant medical attention during the move. Thompson needs to be carried on a stretcher, and Colonel Mitchell can't walk on that leg. The others can probably manage with assistance, but we'll need to stop frequently for medical checks." Harrison nodded, understanding the implications of what Sarah was telling him. Moving wounded soldiers would slow the unit considerably and make them vulnerable to enemy attack, but it was their best chance of getting the seriously injured to proper medical facilities. The alternative was to wait for reinforcements that might not arrive in time to prevent additional casualties. The decision was made to begin moving toward the evacuation site immediately, using the remaining daylight to cover as much ground as possible before the more dangerous nighttime portion of the journey. Sarah would need to prepare her patients for transport, while coordinating with the convoy's remaining vehicles to provide the best possible protection during the move. It was a complex operation that would test every aspect of her medical and leadership skills. Preparing the wounded soldiers for transport required making difficult decisions about pain management and medical support. Sarah needed to provide enough medication to keep her patients comfortable during the difficult journey, but not so much that it would compromise their vital signs or her ability to monitor their conditions. Each patient required individual assessment and treatment plans that could be adjusted as conditions changed during the move. Colonel Mitchell presented the most complex transport challenge. His broken leg could be temporarily splinted for movement, but his internal bleeding meant that any excessive jostling could worsen his condition significantly. Sarah designed a carrying system using materials from the damaged vehicles that would provide maximum stability while allowing her to monitor his vital signs during the journey. The system required 4 soldiers to carry him, which meant 4 fewer soldiers available for defensive operations. Thompson's head injury required equally careful consideration. Moving a patient with potential brain trauma was dangerous under the best circumstances, and doing so across rough mountain terrain while under threat of enemy attack added layers of complexity that tested the limits of battlefield medicine. Sarah created a stabilization system for his head and neck that would minimize movement while allowing for rapid medical intervention if his condition changed. The other critically wounded soldiers each required individual transport considerations. Sarah worked with the unit's remaining personnel to create carrying teams and support systems that would allow the wounded to be moved safely while maintaining the unit's defensive capabilities. It was a delicate balance that required precise coordination and clear communication among all personnel. As preparations for the move continued, enemy activity around their position seemed to be increasing. Scouts reported movement in the hills surrounding their location, and occasional rifle fire suggested that insurgent forces were probing their defensive perimeter. The window for beginning their movement was closing rapidly, and Sarah knew that any delay could make the journey significantly more dangerous. The movement began just as the sun touched the western mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Sarah had organized her patients into groups based on their medical needs and mobility, with the most seriously wounded soldiers being carried by teams while others walked with assistance. She moved constantly between groups, monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatment as needed. The terrain they needed to cross was brutal, even for healthy soldiers. The mountain paths were narrow and rocky, with steep sections that required careful navigation to avoid falls that could injure both patients and the soldiers carrying them. Sarah had walked these paths during training exercises, but never while coordinating the medical care of multiple critically wounded patients under threat of enemy attack. Colonel Mitchell remained conscious and alert during the early part of the journey, even attempting to provide tactical advice to Major Harrison despite his obvious pain. Sarah administered carefully calculated doses of pain medication that would keep him comfortable without compromising his mental clarity or vital signs. His condition remained stable, but she could see signs that his internal bleeding was continuing despite her treatment. Thompson's condition was more concerning. The head injury made him sensitive to movement, and Sarah noticed changes in his pupil responses that suggested increasing intracranial pressure. She was forced to stop the convoy twice during the first hour to perform emergency procedures to stabilize his condition, each time aware that the delays were making them more vulnerable to enemy attack. The other wounded soldiers showed remarkable courage during the difficult journey. Men who should have been in hospital beds were walking across mountain terrain, helping carry their more seriously injured comrades, and maintaining defensive positions despite their own pain and exhaustion. Sarah found herself constantly inspired by their dedication to each other and their refusal to give up despite the impossible circumstances. Enemy contact came sporadically but consistently throughout the journey. Insurgent forces were clearly tracking their movement, launching brief attacks designed to slow their progress and inflict additional casualties. Each contact required the convoy to take defensive positions, which meant lowering the wounded soldiers to the ground and providing medical care while under fire. Sarah became expert at treating patients while lying flat against rocky ground, using boulder outcroppings and vehicle hulks as protection. The weight of her medical pack, combined with the altitude and physical demands of the terrain, began to take a toll on Sarah's own endurance. She had been providing intensive medical care for more than 6 hours, much of it under extremely stressful conditions, and now she was adding the physical demands of a difficult mountain march. But she refused to let fatigue affect her medical judgment or her ability to care for her patients. As darkness began to fall, the convoy's progress slowed significantly. Moving wounded soldiers across dangerous terrain in daylight was challenging enough, but attempting the same movement in darkness with limited visibility was exponentially more dangerous. Sarah worked with Major Harrison to establish rest positions where the wounded could be stabilized and the unit could reorganize for the final push to the evacuation site. The rest stop provided Sarah with an opportunity to reassess her patients' conditions and adjust their treatment plans for the remainder of the journey. Colonel Mitchell's vital signs indicated that his internal bleeding was becoming more serious, and she knew that he needed surgical intervention within the next few hours or his condition would become life-threatening. Thompson showed signs of improvement, but his condition remained critical and unpredictable. Radio contact with headquarters provided updates on the evacuation helicopters and reinforcements, but the news was mixed. Medical evacuation aircraft were standing by and could reach the evacuation site within minutes of being called, but enemy activity in the area meant that landing would be extremely dangerous. Ground reinforcements were making good progress, but were still more than an hour away from their current position. The decision was made to continue the movement toward the evacuation site, despite the increased dangers of nighttime travel. Sarah knew that waiting until morning could mean losing patients who needed immediate surgical care, and the tactical situation suggested that their current position was becoming less defensible as enemy forces continued to gather in the area. The risk of movement had to be balanced against the risk of remaining stationary. The final hour of the journey tested everyone's limits. The mountain path became steeper and more difficult to navigate in darkness, despite the use of night vision equipment and carefully controlled lighting. Sarah found herself constantly moving between her patients, checking vital signs by feel when visual assessment was impossible, and making medical decisions based on limited information and maximum urgency. Colonel Mitchell's condition began to deteriorate during the final approach to the evacuation site. His blood pressure was dropping, and Sarah could see signs that his internal bleeding was accelerating. She made the difficult decision to increase his pain medication to keep him comfortable, knowing that this might compromise his blood pressure further, but understanding that the pain was contributing to shock that could kill him. The evacuation site was a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided some protection from enemy fire. Major Harrison's advance team had already begun establishing a defensive perimeter and marking landing zones for the medical helicopters. Sarah immediately began preparing her patients for evacuation, organizing them by priority, and ensuring that each had proper medical documentation for the hospital teams that would take over their care. The radio call from medical evacuation helicopters went out just as the last of the wounded soldiers reached the evacuation site. Sarah had successfully moved 14 critically wounded soldiers across 2 miles of dangerous mountain terrain under enemy fire, keeping them all alive and stable enough for transport to definitive medical care. But her ordeal was far from over, as the most dangerous part of any medical evacuation was often the extraction itself. As she waited for the helicopters to arrive, Sarah realized that she had been functioning on pure adrenaline and professional training for more than 8 hours. The physical and emotional toll of the day was enormous, but she couldn't allow herself to acknowledge it until every one of her patients was safely on their way to proper medical facilities. The sound of approaching helicopters in the distance meant that her mission was almost complete, but also that the final test was about to begin. The distinctive sound of rotor blades cutting through the mountain air brought both relief and new tension to the soldiers gathered in the small evacuation clearing. Sarah Martinez could hear at least 2 helicopters approaching, their engines echoing off the rocky peaks in a way that would announce their arrival to any enemy forces within miles. She knew from experience that medical evacuations were among the most vulnerable moments in any military operation, when aircraft had to hover in predictable positions while loading critically wounded patients who couldn't defend themselves. Sarah quickly organized her patients according to evacuation priorities, placing the most critically wounded closest to the planned landing zones, while ensuring that each soldier was properly prepared for transport. Colonel Mitchell's condition had continued to deteriorate during the final approach to the evacuation site, and she knew that he would need to be on the first helicopter out. Thompson's head injury remained stable but critical, making him the second priority for evacuation. The first helicopter, UH-60 Black Hawk, configured for medical evacuation, appeared over the eastern ridge and immediately came under fire from insurgent positions that had been tracking the convoy's movement. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness as the aircraft maneuvered to avoid ground fire while attempting to identify a safe landing approach. Sarah watched the pilot's skillful flying as he used the terrain features to mask his approach, but she could see that landing would be extremely dangerous under the current conditions. Major Harrison was coordinating with the helicopter crews by radio, providing updates on enemy positions and the security situation around the landing zone. The pilots were experienced in combat evacuations, but the combination of mountainous terrain, darkness, and active enemy fire created challenges that tested even their considerable skills. Sarah listened to the radio traffic while continuing to monitor her patients, knowing that split-second decisions by the flight crews would determine whether her wounded soldiers could be evacuated safely. The insurgent forces had clearly anticipated that the convoy would attempt to reach this evacuation site, and their positions around the clearing suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic harassment. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different directions, indicating coordinated fields of fire designed to prevent helicopters from landing safely. The enemy understood that preventing medical evacuation would maximize the psychological impact of their ambush, while potentially increasing military casualties. The first helicopter made several approach attempts, each time being driven off by concentrated enemy fire that came uncomfortably close to hitting the aircraft. Sarah could hear the frustration in the pilot's voice as he communicated with ground forces about the impossibility of landing under current conditions. The aircraft carried specialized medical equipment and personnel that could provide advanced life support during transport, but none of that mattered if they couldn't land safely. Sarah made a decision that would later be remembered as one of the most courageous acts of the entire engagement. She realized that the enemy fire was coming from positions that could be neutralized if someone could provide accurate target identification for the defending soldiers. But this would require moving to a position that was completely exposed to enemy fire. Without consulting with Major Harrison or seeking permission, she grabbed her medical pack and began moving toward the ridge where she could spot enemy positions. "Martinez, what are you doing?" Major Harrison called over the radio as he saw her moving away from the relative safety of the landing zone. "Sir, I can see the muzzle flashes from up here," Sarah replied, already climbing toward a rocky outcropping that would give her a clear view of the enemy positions. "If I can direct our fire accurately, we can suppress them long enough for the helicopters to land." It was a calculated risk based on Sarah's assessment that her wounded soldiers would die without immediate evacuation, and that someone had to take action to make evacuation possible. The position she was moving toward would give her an excellent view of the enemy firing positions, but it would also make her a prime target for insurgent marksmen who would recognize the threat she posed to their operation. Sarah reached the exposed position and immediately began identifying enemy firing positions for the soldiers, providing perimeter security. Her calm, professional voice came over the radio as she called out precise locations and recommended engagement priorities. "Harrison, I have 3 positions on the North Ridge, approximately 200 meters from the landing zone. They have clear fields of fire on both approach routes." The effect of accurate target identification was immediate and dramatic. The convoy's remaining heavy weapons engaged the enemy positions with precision that would have been impossible without Sarah's spotting. Within minutes, the volume of enemy fire directed at the landing zone decreased significantly, though sporadic shots continued from other positions around the clearing. The first helicopter pilot seized the opportunity created by the suppressed enemy fire and committed to a landing approach that required exceptional skill and courage. Sarah watched from her exposed position as the Black Hawk descended through defensive fire, its crew chief returning fire with mounted weapons, while the pilot focused on landing in a confined area surrounded by obstacles. The aircraft touched down heavily, but safely, immediately beginning the process of loading the most critically wounded soldiers. Colonel Mitchell was loaded onto the first helicopter along with 3 other critically wounded soldiers, each accompanied by medical documentation that Sarah had prepared during the journey. She watched from her spotting position as her patients were transferred to the aircraft's advanced life support systems, knowing that they were finally receiving the level of medical care that could save their lives. The helicopter lifted off within 3 minutes of landing, disappearing into the darkness toward the main military hospital. The second helicopter faced similar challenges during its approach, but the suppression of enemy positions made landing significantly safer. Sarah continued to provide target identification from her exposed position, calling out new enemy locations as insurgent forces repositioned to engage the aircraft. Her spotting was so accurate that the convoy's defensive fires were able to prevent most enemy attacks from being effective. Thompson and 4 other seriously wounded soldiers were loaded onto the second helicopter, along with soldiers whose injuries required surgical intervention that couldn't be provided in the field. Sarah felt enormous relief as she watched the aircraft lift off safely, knowing that the most critically wounded members of her unit were finally on their way to proper medical facilities. But her relief was tempered by the realization that she still had multiple wounded soldiers who needed continued care. The departure of the medical evacuation helicopters seemed to trigger increased enemy activity around the evacuation site. Insurgent forces that had been focused on preventing the aircraft from landing were now free to concentrate their attention on the remaining soldiers in the clearing. Sarah found herself in an increasingly dangerous position, exposed on the ridge where she had been spotting enemy positions with limited cover and a growing number of insurgents who recognized her as a priority target. The decision to remain in the exposed spotting position or return to the relative safety of the landing zone became academic when Sarah realized that several wounded soldiers were still in the clearing and would need her medical attention during the wait for additional evacuation flights. She began moving back toward her patients, using every available piece of cover while enemy fire tracked her movement across the rocky terrain. During her movement back to the landing zone, Sarah encountered Specialist Davis, a young soldier who had been wounded during the initial ambush but had walked the entire distance to the evacuation site. Davis had been hit by shrapnel in his right shoulder and had lost a significant amount of blood during the journey, but he had refused to be evacuated with the more critically wounded soldiers. Now exhaustion and blood loss were taking their toll, and he collapsed just as Sarah reached his position. Sarah immediately began treating Davis for shock and blood loss while using her radio to update Major Harrison on her location and the status of her remaining patients. Davis was conscious but disoriented, and his vital signs indicated that he needed immediate medical intervention to prevent his condition from becoming life-threatening. The irony was not lost on Sarah that after successfully treating the most critically wounded soldiers, she was now dealing with a medical emergency caused by a soldier who had seemed stable throughout the ordeal. Working on Davis while exposed to enemy fire required Sarah to utilize every piece of medical training she had received about treating patients under combat conditions. She established intravenous access using tactical medical techniques designed for use while under fire, administered fluids and medications to combat shock, and created a makeshift stretcher system that would allow Davis to be moved to better cover without worsening his injuries. The process of moving Davis to the landing zone while maintaining his medical treatment and avoiding enemy fire became one of the most technically challenging procedures Sarah had performed during the entire engagement. She was essentially functioning as a one-person medical team, providing advanced life support while coordinating her own movement and maintaining situational awareness of the tactical situation around her. Radio reports indicated that additional medical evacuation flights were en route, but the enemy activity around the landing zone meant that subsequent evacuations would be even more dangerous than the first two. Sarah found herself in the position of preparing multiple wounded soldiers for evacuation while simultaneously planning for the possibility that helicopters might not be able to land safely. As she worked with her remaining patients, Sarah became aware that her own physical condition was beginning to affect her performance. She had been providing intensive medical care for more than 10 hours, much of it under extremely stressful conditions, and the combination of physical exertion, altitude, and emotional stress was taking its toll. But she refused to acknowledge her own limitations while soldiers under her care still needed medical attention. The third helicopter to approach the landing zone came under the heaviest enemy fire yet, as insurgent forces had repositioned to create interlocking fields of fire that made landing extremely dangerous. Sarah watched the pilot make multiple approach attempts, each time being forced to abort as enemy fire came close to hitting critical aircraft systems. The frustration was evident in radio communications as flight crews and ground forces struggled to find a way to complete the evacuation safely. During one of the helicopter's approach attempts, Sarah noticed that enemy fire was coming from a position that hadn't been active during the earlier evacuations. A small team of insurgents had moved to a location that provided an excellent firing position on the landing zone, but was concealed from the convoy's defensive positions. She realized that neutralizing this position would require someone to move to another exposed location to provide target identification. Without hesitation, Sarah began moving toward a position where she could spot the newly identified enemy location. Major Harrison tried to stop her over the radio, pointing out that she had already taken enormous risks and that other soldiers could handle the spotting mission. But Sarah knew that her medical expertise was still needed for the remaining wounded soldiers, and that exposing other personnel to the same risks would only multiply the potential casualties. The movement to the new spotting position required Sarah to cross an area that was completely exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. She used smoke grenades and covering fire from friendly positions to mask her movement, but the enemy forces were clearly tracking her progress and concentrating their fire on her probable routes. It was during this movement that Sarah truly understood how much her actions throughout the day had made her a priority target for enemy forces. Sarah reached the new position and immediately identified the enemy firing team that was preventing helicopter landings. Her radio call was calm and professional despite the fact that she was taking direct fire from multiple positions. "Harrison, I have 2 personnel with automatic weapons in the rocks about 150 meters northwest of the landing zone. They have a clear shot at any aircraft trying to land." The engagement of the newly identified enemy position was swift and effective, allowing the 3rd helicopter to complete its approach and landing safely. Sarah watched from her exposed position as the remaining seriously wounded soldiers were loaded onto the aircraft, knowing that her mission was finally nearing completion. But she also realized that her own situation was becoming increasingly desperate as enemy forces continued to focus their attention on her position. The successful departure of the 3rd evacuation helicopter marked the end of the immediate medical crisis. But Sarah found herself trapped in an exposed position with limited ammunition, depleted medical supplies, and an unknown number of enemy forces between her and the relative safety of the convoy's defensive perimeter. The next phase of her ordeal would test not just her medical skills, but her survival instincts and combat training in ways that would push her beyond every limit she had previously imagined. Alone on the rocky ridge with enemy forces closing in around her position, Sarah Martinez faced the most dangerous moment of what had already been the longest day of her military career. The successful evacuation of the critically wounded soldiers had accomplished her primary mission, but now she found herself in a tactical situation that no medical training had prepared her for. The insurgent forces that had been tracking her movement throughout the day recognized that eliminating the medic who had frustrated their ambush would be both a tactical victory and a psychological blow to the surviving soldiers. From her exposed position, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different locations as enemy forces maneuvered to surround her. The rocky terrain that had provided excellent observation for spotting enemy positions now became a maze of potential hiding places for insurgents who knew the ground better than she did. Her radio communications with Major Harrison were becoming increasingly urgent as both of them recognized that she was running out of options for safe movement back to the convoy's defensive perimeter. The weight of her medical pack, which had been a manageable burden during the journey to the evacuation site, now felt enormous as Sarah contemplated the movement she would need to make to reach safety. But inside that pack were medical supplies that might be needed if any of the remaining soldiers were wounded during the final phase of their ordeal. She refused to abandon equipment that could save lives, even though carrying it would make her movement slower and more difficult. Sarah's assessment of her tactical situation was grimly professional. She had limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and was facing an unknown number of enemy forces on terrain that favored the defenders. Her advantages were her knowledge of the convoy's defensive positions, her radio communications with friendly forces, and her determination to rejoin her unit regardless of the personal risk involved. It was the kind of situation that separated soldiers who survived from those who didn't. Major Harrison's voice came over the radio with a tone of controlled urgency that Sarah recognized from other crisis situations. "Martinez, we're going to create a diversion on the south side of the perimeter. When you hear our heavy weapons open up, start moving toward checkpoint Alpha. We'll provide covering fire, but you're going to have to move fast." Sarah acknowledged the plan while mentally preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous movement of her military career. The distance to checkpoint Alpha was approximately 400 meters across terrain that provided minimal cover and maximum exposure to enemy fire. She would need to cover that distance while carrying her medical pack and avoiding enemy forces that were specifically hunting for her. The diversion began with a concentrated barrage of heavy weapons fire directed at suspected enemy positions on the southern perimeter of the convoy's defensive area. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of machine guns, grenade launchers, and small arms fire as the convoy's remaining soldiers engaged targets that would draw enemy attention away from her planned route. The volume of fire was impressive, but Sarah knew that the diversion would only be effective for a limited time before enemy forces adapted to the new threat. Sarah began her movement during the height of the diversionary attack, using the noise and confusion to mask her initial movement away from the exposed ridge position. The first 100 meters required her to cross completely open ground with no cover except for a few scattered boulders, but the enemy fire seemed to be focused on responding to the diversion rather than tracking her movement. The medical pack's weight became more noticeable as Sarah moved across the rough terrain, but she maintained her pace by focusing on reaching intermediate positions where she could briefly assess her situation and plan the next phase of her movement. Her breathing was controlled despite the physical exertion, a testament to the physical conditioning that was part of every soldier's preparation for combat deployment. Enemy fire began tracking her movement as Sarah reached the midpoint of her journey back to the convoy. Rifle bullets cracked past her position with a distinctive sound that every combat veteran learns to recognize, and she could hear voices in the distance that suggested enemy forces were communicating about her location. The psychological pressure of being hunted was enormous, but Sarah's focus remained on reaching her destination safely rather than engaging in combat with pursuers. During a brief pause behind a large boulder, Sarah used her radio to provide updates on her movement and request adjustments to the covering fire that was being provided by friendly forces. Her voice was calm and professional despite the fact that she was under direct fire, displaying the kind of composure under pressure that had earned her the respect of every soldier she had served alongside. "Harrison, I'm taking fire from the northwest, approximately 200 meters from checkpoint Alpha," Sarah reported while assessing her options for the final phase of her movement. "I can see at least 3 muzzle flashes from positions that weren't active during the diversion." Major Harrison's response was immediate and reassuring. "Martinez, we have you on thermal imaging. Stay put for 30 seconds while we engage those positions. When you hear our fire shift to the northeast, make your final move to checkpoint Alpha." The 30 seconds felt like an eternity as Sarah waited behind her boulder while enemy fire impacted around her position. She could hear the sound of bullets striking rock and the whistle of fragments flying past her location. The enemy forces had clearly identified her position and were concentrating their fire in an attempt to pin her down until additional insurgents could move to engage her directly. The shift in friendly fire was unmistakable when it came. Sarah could hear heavy machine gun fire and grenade explosions directed at the positions that had been engaging her, followed by a noticeable decrease in enemy fire coming her direction. She immediately began her final movement toward checkpoint Alpha, knowing that the window of opportunity created by the covering fire would be brief. The final 200 meters of Sarah's movement required her to cross a section of terrain that was completely exposed to observation from multiple directions. She moved in short rushes, using every available piece of cover while maintaining awareness of enemy positions and friendly forces. Her military training had emphasized the importance of controlled movement under fire, and she applied every technique she had learned during years of preparation for exactly this situation. As Sarah approached the convoy's defensive perimeter, she could see soldiers in fighting positions who were providing covering fire for her movement. Their disciplined fire control and tactical positioning demonstrated the professionalism that had kept the unit together throughout the extended engagement. The sight of friendly forces was enormously reassuring after hours of isolation under enemy fire. The final sprint to Checkpoint Alpha required Sarah to cross 30 meters of completely open ground, while enemy forces made desperate attempts to prevent her from reaching safety. Rifle fire and grenade explosions bracketed her movement, but the covering fire from friendly positions was accurate and effective in suppressing the worst of the enemy attacks. Sarah reached the defensive perimeter and dove into a fighting position just as a grenade exploded in the area she had vacated seconds earlier. Major Harrison was waiting at Checkpoint Alpha with a tactical situation update and genuine relief at Sarah's safe return. The defensive perimeter was holding, but ammunition was running low, and enemy forces continued to probe for weaknesses in their positions. Ground reinforcements were still more than 30 minutes away, which meant the unit would need to maintain their defense for an extended period while managing limited resources. Sarah's first priority after reaching safety was to assess the medical status of the soldiers who had remained with the convoy during the evacuation operation. Several soldiers had suffered minor injuries during the extended engagement, and others were showing signs of exhaustion and stress that could affect their combat effectiveness. She immediately began providing medical care while updating her assessment of the unit's overall condition. The irony was not lost on Sarah that after successfully evacuating multiple critically wounded soldiers and surviving a dangerous solo movement under enemy fire, she was now dealing with routine medical issues that seemed almost mundane in comparison. But her professional training emphasized that every medical issue was important, regardless of the circumstances, and she approached each patient with the same attention to detail that had characterized her performance throughout the engagement. Radio communications brought updates on the approaching reinforcements and additional air support that would soon arrive to assist with the final phase of their defense. Attack helicopters were en route to engage enemy positions around the defensive perimeter, and a mechanized infantry unit was making rapid progress across the mountainous terrain toward their location. The end of their ordeal was finally approaching, but Sarah knew from experience that the final phase of any engagement could be the most dangerous. As Sarah worked with her patients and coordinated with Major Harrison on defensive preparations, she became aware that her actions during the engagement had created a reputation that extended beyond her immediate unit. Radio traffic from headquarters and incoming reinforcements referenced the medic who carried the colonel and Martinez's medical miracle, indicating that word of her performance was spreading through military communication networks. The psychological impact of Sarah's actions on both friendly and enemy forces was becoming apparent as the engagement entered its final phase. The successful evacuation of wounded soldiers had demonstrated to insurgent forces that their ambush had failed to achieve its intended effect, while the courage and competence displayed by the convoy had reinforced the morale of every soldier involved in the operation. Ground reinforcements arrived just as darkness was giving way to early morning light, bringing additional medical personnel who could assist with ongoing patient care and provide Sarah with the first real rest she had experienced in nearly 15 hours. The mechanized infantry unit established a wider defensive perimeter that eliminated the immediate threat from enemy forces, allowing for the final evacuation of wounded soldiers and the recovery of equipment from damaged vehicles. Sarah's formal after-action report would later become required reading at military medical training facilities, but the clinical details of her medical procedures could never capture the full impact of what she had accomplished. In a single day, she had treated more than 40 wounded soldiers under combat conditions, coordinated multiple medical evacuations under fire, and demonstrated the kind of personal courage that inspired everyone who witnessed it. The evacuation of Colonel Mitchell and the other critically wounded soldiers have been successful, with all patients surviving their injuries and making full recoveries. Thompson, the soldier with the severe head injury, returned to active duty 6 months later with no permanent effect from his trauma. The medical care provided by Sarah during the critical hours immediately after their injuries had made the difference between life and death for multiple soldiers. As Sarah finally allowed herself to rest during the helicopter flight back to the main base, she reflected on the events of the day with the kind of professional assessment that characterized her approach to every aspect of military service. She had performed her duties as a medic to the best of her abilities under extraordinary circumstances, and the successful outcome validated years of training and preparation for exactly this type of situation. The formal recognition that would follow, including multiple medals for valor and medical excellence, was important for official acknowledgement of her service, but Sarah knew that the real measure of her success was simpler. Every soldier under her care had survived. In a profession where success was measured in lives saved rather than recognition received, Sarah Martinez had achieved the kind of perfect record that would define her legacy for decades to come. The story of the field medic who carried a colonel 2 miles while saving 200 soldiers would be told and retold in military circles, growing with each telling into the kind of legend that inspired future generations of military medical personnel. But for Sarah, it would always be remembered as the day she did her job under impossible circumstances, proving that heroism was not about seeking glory, but about refusing to let others down when they needed help the most.